She found him in the coal cellar, a small boy with hair like winter frost and skin that shouldn't belong to anything living. His eyes glowed red in the darkness. His touch was colder than death itself. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But Edna Slack had never been good at self-preservation. She wrapped him in a shawl anyway. What she didn't know, the Vampire King had been hunting for his stolen son for 3 nights straight, leaving bodies in his wake. And when he found a human servant cradling his disabled heir like he was precious, like he was wanted, everything Charles Perry believed about humans and himself shattered in an instant. The grandfather clock struck midnight with a hollow echo that filled the empty halls of the Perry estate. Edna's knees pressed against cold marble as she scrubbed the grand entrance, her hands raw and bleeding from lye soap. The other servants had fled hours ago, whispering prayers as they ran. 3 nights since the young master vanished. 3 nights since the Vampire King's rage turned the countryside into a hunting ground. She should have run too. But fear was a luxury Edna Slack couldn't afford. Not when her mother's medicine cost more than she earned in a month. Not when this position at the estate, dangerous as it had become, was the only thing keeping her mother alive. The candles flickered. Once, twice. Then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it beneath the wind rattling the windows. A child's whimper, weak and terrified, coming from somewhere below, from the abandoned coal cellar where servants were forbidden to go. Edna froze, her scrub brush clenched in bleeding fingers. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it. Mountain lions sometimes prowled the estate grounds. Worse things, too, the kind that drained bodies and left them pale as wax, the kind that served the Vampire King and answered to no law but his. The whimper came again, sharper this time, more desperate. A child. Edna pushed herself to her feet, knees protesting. She grabbed the single candle from the entrance hall and moved toward the servants' stairwell, toward the sound that pulled at something deep in her chest. The part of her that remembered being small and frightened and alone, waiting for help that never came. This time, she decided, someone would come, even if it killed her. Dawn broke cold and merciless over the Perry estate. But Charles didn't feel it. He felt nothing except the pull of his son's scent. Faint, impossibly faint, but there. 3 nights of hunting through blood and ash, and the trail ended here, in his own house, in the servants' wing. The rage that seized him was ancient and absolute. He moved through the corridors like death itself, faster than mortal eyes could follow. Servants who dared to remain scattered at his approach, pressing themselves against walls, prayers dying on their lips. Charles barely registered them. His son's scent grew stronger with each step. Milk and... She ducked her head, and Charles caught the gesture. The instinctive submission of someone who'd learned to make herself small. "I didn't know he was yours. I swear I didn't steal. You saved him." The words tasted like confession, like failure. 3 nights I searched, burned through half the countryside, and you found him in my own house. The coal cellar. Edna whispered. "He was so cold, my lord. I couldn't just—" "You will stay here." Charles cut her off, the decision crystallizing with brutal clarity. His son needed her. That was the only fact that mattered. "My son requires your presence. You will remain in the manor. You will not speak of this to anyone. You will—" "My mother." Edna's voice cracked. "She needs her medicine. I'll see to it." Charles moved toward the door, then stopped, looked back at them. His son, nestled against a stranger who'd shown him more tenderness in 1 night than Charles had managed in 3 months. "You will stay here. My son needs you." He didn't say the rest. Didn't say, "And so do I." Didn't say, "You're the only one who can reach him." Didn't say, "I failed his mother. I won't fail him again, even if it means keeping you prisoner." For now," he added, voice cold as a tomb. Edna met his eyes, and Charles saw the understanding dawn in her expression. She wasn't a guest. She was a necessity, a tool. And in the Vampire King's house, necessary things were never permitted to leave. The door rebuilt itself behind him with a whisper of old magic, and Charles left her there, this human woman who'd done what he could not, who'd made his son feel safe. The nursery wing had been beautiful once. Edna could see it in the faded wallpaper, the gilt-edged mirrors now tarnished, the cradle carved from dark wood that sat empty in the corner like a small coffin. Dust covered everything except the space Charles had cleared with a single sweep of his hand, violent and efficient. "You will not leave these rooms." He stood by the window, silhouetted against dawn light that made him look carved from marble. "You will speak to no one about my son? Not the servants? Not the guards? No one?" Edna nodded, the boy still clutched in her arms. She didn't trust her voice. 3 nights ago, rebels attacked this estate." Charles's words came hard, like each one cost him. "They wanted him dead. My son. They burned the nursery, killed his wet nurse, and took him to finish what they started." "Why?" The question escaped before Edna could stop it. Charles turned, and the look in his eyes was ancient and bitter. "Because he's defective. Because sunlight weakens him in ways it shouldn't. Because my wife died bringing him into this world, and the court sees him as the reason she's gone." His jaw tightened. "Because many believe I should remarry. Produce a proper heir instead of protecting a weak one." The boy stirred against Edna's chest, making a small sound of distress. She automatically began humming, that old lullaby, and watched Charles flinch. She wanted him to know warmth. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "My wife. She made me promise. Said he'd need it more than others." He looked at his hands, pale and elegant and capable of terrible violence. "I don't know how to give him that." Something in Edna's chest cracked open. This wasn't just a monster. This was a man drowning in grief, terrified he was failing the only piece of his wife he had left. "The song helps him," she offered quietly. Maybe she knew it would. Maybe. Charles moved towards the door. "I must attend the High Council. Explain why I've been hunting instead of ruling." His eyes found hers, cold and measuring. "2 guards will remain outside. They're loyal to me. Everyone else in this house." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Everyone else wanted his son dead. The hours after Charles left felt like holding her breath underwater. Edna explored the nursery carefully. The boy, she couldn't keep thinking of him as the boy. He needed a name. Watching her with those luminous eyes that shifted from amber to soft gold, depending on the light. "Little star," she thought, because that's what he looked like, a small constellation fallen to earth. She discovered quickly that he didn't speak. His mouth would open, shape sounds, but nothing emerged except small whimpers when he was frightened. Trauma, Edna recognized. She'd seen it in her own mirror years ago, after her father's fists had taught her that some hurts went too deep for words. But Little Star communicated in other ways. Pointed at things he wanted. Tugged her toward the window when he grew restless. Pressed his cold little hand against her cheek when she sang, as if he could feel the vibrations of her voice through his palm. "You understand more than they think, don't you?" Edna whispered, brushing white hair from his forehead. "They see what's broken, not what's still whole." Little Star's eyes glowed brighter. Agreement, she thought, or perhaps gratitude that someone finally saw him. She found children's books on a shelf, dusty from disuse. Sat with him in the window seat and read aloud, watching his face light up at the illustrations. He couldn't turn pages without her help. His hands were weak, trembling with the effort. But his mind was sharp. She could see it in how he anticipated the story, pointing to pictures before she reached them. "Your father loves you," Edna said softly as afternoon shadows lengthened. "He's just forgotten how to show it." Little Star looked at her with such ancient sadness that Edna's throat closed. He knew. Of course he knew. His gift, that terrible sensitivity, meant he felt his father's grief like a physical weight, felt the court's disgust, felt every moment of being unwanted. "I want you," Edna whispered fiercely, pulling him close. "You hear me? I want you exactly as you are." The boy's small arms wrapped around her neck, and Edna felt him shake with silent sobs. How long had he needed to hear those words? How long had he been waiting for someone to choose him? Evening came. Edna sang the lullaby again, all the verses her mother had taught her, even though she still didn't know what the old words meant. Little Star's eyes grew heavy, his body finally relaxing against hers. She carried him to the small cot Charles had indicated was hers, unwilling to put him in that empty cradle that looked too much like a cage. "Sleep now," she murmured. "I've got you, I promise." His breathing evened out. That cold little hand stayed curled in her sleeve, even in sleep. Edna's own eyes grew heavy, the exhaustion of 3 nights' work and 1 morning's terror finally catching up. She let herself drift, still humming, still holding this child who'd somehow become hers in the space of a single day. She didn't hear the door open, didn't sense the presence until a woman's voice, smooth as silk and sharp as broken glass, cut through the darkness. How unfortunate. The human has made this complicated. Edna's eyes snapped open. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, elegant, dressed in crimson that seemed to drink the lamplight. Not Charles. Someone else. Someone whose smile promised things worse than death. And Little Star, still sleeping in her arms, began to whimper in his dreams. Edna moved on instinct. She rolled off the cot. Little Star clutched against her chest and put herself between the child and the woman in crimson. Her free hand found the fire poker by the cold hearth, wrought iron, heavy, real. "Stay back." Her voice shook, but her grip didn't. Lady Morrivan laughed. The sound was beautiful and terrible, like bells tolling for the dead. How delightful! The servant girl thinks she can fight. She gestured, and 2 figures emerged from the shadows behind her, vampires dressed in servants' livery, their faces blank and pitiless. "I am Lady Morrivan, child. I ordered his kidnapping. I orchestrated the attack. And I certainly won't be threatened by a human with a fire iron. Why?" Edna's mind raced, cataloguing the room. Door blocked, window too high, no escape. He's just a baby. He's a mistake. Morrivan glided forward, her movements liquid and inhuman. Charles's wife was weak. She died bringing this defective thing into the world, and now he clings to it out of misplaced guilt. The High Council agreed. Remove the heir, force him to remarry. My daughter would make an excellent queen. Her smile sharpened. But then you interfered, saved him, made Charles believe this farce can continue. Little Star whimpered against Edna's neck. She could feel his small body trembling, those cold fingers digging into her shoulder with desperate strength. "I won't let you touch him," Edna said. "You won't have a choice." The assassins moved faster than thought. Edna swung the poker blindly, felt it connect with solid flesh. One of them hissed, actually hissed, and stumbled back. She grabbed for the oil lamp on the side table, hurled it. Glass shattered. Fire bloomed across the ancient carpet. "You will not touch him." The words tore from her throat, feral and fierce. This was what her father's fists had taught her, how to fight when cornered, how to make yourself dangerous when you had nothing left to lose. She threw the lye soap from her apron pocket into the second assassin's face. He screamed, clawing at his eyes. Edna ran for the door, Little Star clutched tight, but Moravin was there suddenly, impossibly fast, her hand closing around Edna's throat. Resourceful. Moravin's grip tightened. Edna's vision sparked, but ultimately pointless. She lifted Edna off the ground with one hand and slammed her against the stone wall. Edna's skull cracked against ancient rock. Warmth flooded down her neck. Blood, she realized distantly. So much blood. The world tilted, greyed at the edges. Little Star was falling. She'd dropped him. No. Edna threw herself forward, blind with pain and terror. She hit the floor hard, scrambled toward the boy on hands and knees. The assassins were recovering, moving toward him with cold purpose. No! She flung herself over Little Star's small body, arms wrapped around him, making herself a shield of flesh and bone. She felt the first assassin's hand close around her shoulder, claws digging deep, felt her own scream rip through the air. Please, she sobbed. Please, he's just a child. Her blood dripped onto Little Star's hand. The world exploded. Light erupted from the boy, blinding, ancient, furious. Not the soft amber glow of his eyes, but something else entirely. Pure white radiance that felt like standing in a star. Edna felt the barrier form around them, felt it pulse with power that made her teeth ache and her bones sing. The assassins were thrown backward like leaves in a storm. They hit the walls with sounds like breaking branches. Lady Moravin screamed, actual fear in her voice, as the barrier expanded, forcing her towards the door. Impossible! Moravin gasped. That magic is extinct. The royal line lost its centuries. The barrier pulsed again, and she fled. Edna's vision was fading. She could feel Little Star beneath her, could feel the warmth of her own blood pooling around them both. The barrier crackled overhead, a dome of light that kept everything out but trapped them inside. Good boy, she whispered. So clever, so strong. Little Star was screaming now, silent screams, mouth open in anguish, tears streaming down his pale face. His small hands grabbed at Edna's, trying to hold her, trying to keep her there. It's okay, she lied. You're safe now. The world went dark. She didn't hear the door explode inward for the second time in a day. Didn't hear Charles's roar of rage shake the foundation stones. Didn't see him take in the scene, his son surrounded by impossible magic, the human woman bleeding out on his nursery floor, assassins broken against the walls. Didn't see Charles fall to his knees at the barrier's edge, unable to reach them, his hand pressed against light that wouldn't yield. Edna. His voice cracked on her name. Edna, don't you dare! But she was already gone, sinking into darkness that felt almost peaceful after so much terror. Her last thought was of Little Star, crying behind his wall of light, alone again. Always alone. Charles stared at the barrier that separated him from his son, from the woman who'd tried to save him. The barrier that only activated in the presence of genuine love, genuine sacrifice. The magic his bloodline had lost when they'd forgotten what those words meant. His son had found it again, because of her. Edna. He said her name again, softer this time. A prayer, a plea. Come back, he needs you. The barrier pulsed. Little Star's screams had gone silent. The boy's eyes found his father through the light, and Charles saw the accusation there. The question, will you save her? Can you? Charles looked at his hands, looked at the ancient magic his son had summoned, looked at the woman bleeding out behind a wall of light that wouldn't let him through. I will, he whispered. I swear it. Behind him, Lady Moravin's assassins stirred. He killed them without looking, his rage given physical form, shadows that moved like knives. But the barrier wouldn't fall, not until Edna woke. If she woke. Charles had killed before, centuries of it, but never like this. Never with his hands shaking, never with his son's silent screams echoing in his ears, never with a human woman's blood pooling at his feet, and the terror that he was too late, always too late. The remaining assassin tried to crawl towards the door. Charles's shadow caught him first, wrapped around his throat like a noose. The snap was quick, clean, merciful in a way the bastard didn't deserve. Lady Morivin was already gone, fled while he'd been frozen at the barrier's edge, watching Edna's life drain away. But Charles would find her. He'd marked her scent, and there was nowhere in this world or the next where she could hide from what was coming. But first, please. His voice cracked. The barrier pulsed between him and his son, between him and the woman who'd done what he couldn't. Let me in. Let me help her. Little Star stared at him through crackling light, tears streaming down his pale face. The boy's hands were pressed against Edna's chest, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to hold her here through sheer desperate will. Charles understood then. The barrier was bonded to Edna's life force. It wouldn't fall until she woke. If she woke. I can save her. Charles pressed his hand against the barrier, felt it burn his palm. But you have to trust me. You have to let me through. His son's eyes, so like his mother's, searched Charles's face, looking for the lie, looking for the violence that lived in his blood, finding instead something the boy had never seen before. Fear. The barrier flickered, weakened. Charles pushed through, felt it tear at him like thorns, and then he was on his knees beside them both. Edna's pulse was thread-thin. Her skin had gone grey. Minutes, maybe. Not more. He tore open his wrist with his fangs. This is forbidden. He whispered to his son, to himself, to the ghost of his wife, who'd made him promise to do better. The High Council will call it abomination, but I don't care. I don't— He pressed his bleeding wrist to Edna's lips, forced his blood past her teeth, massaging her throat until she swallowed reflexively. Once, twice. The change was immediate. Her wounds began to close, skin knitting over bone. Colour returned to her cheeks. But her eyes stayed closed, and Charles felt the terror claw higher in his chest. "Wake up," he commanded, begged. "You don't get to die. Not for us. Not like this." The barrier shuddered and fell. Little Star collapsed forward, exhausted by magic too big for his small body. Charles caught him with his free arm, held both of them, his son and this human woman who'd become necessary, while his blood worked its ancient alchemy in Edna's veins. I couldn't save his mother. The confession broke something in Charles's chest. I watched her die, and I couldn't stop it. I won't lose you both. I won't— Little Star's small hand touched his face. The boy's fingers were cold and trembling, but the gesture was deliberate, intentional. Forgiveness, Charles realized, or perhaps just understanding that some things couldn't be saved, no matter how much power you had. 2 days passed in vigil. Charles moved Edna to the master bedroom, his bedroom, with its heavy curtains and ancient bed where his wife had died. He laid her in sheets that still smelled faintly of lavender and grief, and he sat beside her while his blood did its work. Little Star refused to leave. The boy curled against Edna's side, one hand clutching her sleeve, those luminous eyes watching her face for any sign of waking. On the second night, Charles began to sing. He didn't know why. The lullaby had been his wife's, and he'd only caught fragments of it before she died. But he sang what he remembered, his voice rough and unpracticed, stumbling over words in a language older than his kingdom. Little Star's eyes widened. Then, impossibly, the boy began to hum along. The parts Charles had forgotten, the melody that should have been lost. Father and son, singing together for the first time, calling her back from whatever darkness had claimed her. "Come back," Charles whispered between verses. "He needs you. The words caught. "We need you." Edna's fingers twitched. Charles grabbed her hand, felt the pulse stronger now, steadier. Little Star scrambled closer, his cold little hands patting her face, urging her awake with wordless desperation. Her eyes opened, gold-flecked brown, confused and beautiful and alive. "Welcome back, Heartkeeper." Charles's voice was steady now, though his hands shook where they held hers. "We have much to discuss." Edna stared at him, at the ornate room, at Little Star, who'd thrown himself against her chest, making sounds of relief and joy and terror all mixed together. "What?" Her voice was hoarse. "What did you do?" "I saved you." Charles met her eyes. "And in doing so, I've bound you to us in ways that can't be undone. My blood is in your veins now. You'll live longer than mortals should. Heal faster. Sense things you couldn't before." He paused. "The High Council will consider it an abomination, but I find I no longer care what they think." Edna's free hand came up to touch Little Star's hair. The boy was crying, soundless sobs that shook his whole body. "He thought he'd lost you," Charles said quietly. "We both did." And in that moment, holding his son while this human woman woke from death in his dead wife's bed, Charles understood what his queen had been trying to tell him. Love wasn't weakness. It was the only thing worth saving. Edna woke in silk sheets that cost more than her entire life. The master bedroom stretched around her like a cathedral, all dark wood and velvet drapes and impossibly high ceilings. This wasn't the servants' wing. This was royalty. This was wrong. "You're awake." Charles stood by the window, backlit by candlelight. "Good. We don't have much time. My mother is here, in the East Wing, with the best physicians my gold can buy." He turned, and Edna saw exhaustion carved into his immortal features. "I've handled everything. Your debts, her care, your situation." "What situation?" But Edna already knew. She could feel it, the strength in her limbs that shouldn't be there, the sharpness of her senses, the way sounds carried differently now. His blood had changed her. "The High Council demands an audience." Charles's voice was flat. "They'll accuse you of bewitching my son, of using dark magic to seduce your way into power. They'll want you executed as an example." Fear tightened around Edna's throat. "And you're going to let them?" "No." The single word carried the weight of centuries. "I'm going to present you as what you are, Heartkeeper, an ancient title from before we decided humans were beneath us." He moved to the wardrobe, pulled out a gown the color of fresh blood. "You'll wear my colors. You'll stand before them as mine. And you'll survive this, because I won't allow any other outcome." The dress fit like it had been made for her, deep crimson silk that whispered against skin she barely recognized as her own. Charles fastened the clasps himself, his cold fingers steady against her spine. "I'm a servant," Edna whispered. "I don't know how to—" "You fought assassins with lye soap and a fire poker." Charles turned her to face him. "You shielded my son with your body. You loved him when no one else could." His eyes found hers. "You already know how to be what they fear most, someone who refuses to accept their place." The great hall was a cavern of judgment. Ancient vampires lined the walls, some in medieval finery, others in clothes from centuries Edna couldn't name. All of them stared at her like she was carrion, like she was already dead. Charles's hand stayed firm at the small of her back as he led her to the center of the marble floor. "Members of the High Council," he began, voice echoing off stone. "I present Edna Slack, Heartkeeper to the royal heir." The chamber erupted. Shouts of outrage, accusations, threats that made Edna's newly sharp hearing ring. An elderly vampire in black robes stepped forward, his face twisted with disgust. "You've given her your blood, bound her to you like a consort. It's obscene." "It was necessary," Charles said coldly. "She saved my son's life, twice, while this court was busy plotting against him." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Edna felt eyes boring into her from every direction, weighing, calculating, finding her wanting. "She bewitched the child," someone called out. "Used human tricks to—" "I didn't bewitch anyone." Edna's voice cracked, but it carried. Every face turned toward her. "I just refused to let a child die alone." The silence that followed felt like standing on a cliff's edge. She speaks. An elegant vampire woman, young-looking, with eyes that held centuries, moved forward with something like curiosity. And with her own voice, not borrowed courage from the king. "Interesting. Lady Sirene," Charles acknowledged with a slight nod. "You remember the old ways." "I remember when Heartkeepers walked among us freely, before we decided fear was stronger than cooperation." Sirene's gaze swept the court. "Before we started calling our children defective and murdering them for political convenience." More vampires shifted. Edna sensed the division, old versus young, tradition versus survival. "I propose a law," Charles declared. "Any vampire who harms a human serving their household with genuine care will face execution. No exceptions. No appeals." The chamber exploded again. Half the court surged toward the doors in protest. The other half, younger faces mostly, remained, watching with eyes that held something like hope. Then the side door opened. Little Star stood there, small and pale and impossibly brave. He looked at the assembled court, at the sea of faces that had called him defective, unwanted, wrong. Then his eyes found Edna. He walked toward her on unsteady legs, each step deliberate. The court fell silent, watching this child they'd tried to kill cross the marble floor with quiet determination. He reached Edna and wrapped his arms around her waist, looked up at her with those luminous eyes that now glowed gold instead of fearful red. "Mama." The word rang through the hall like a bell, his first word, spoken before the entire court, chosen freely, deliberately, in front of witnesses who could never claim enchantment when faced with such obvious truth. Edna's eyes burned. She lifted Little Star into her arms. He was so light, so fragile, and held him against her chest while he buried his face in her neck. "That," Charles said quietly to the assembled court, "is what genuine love looks like. Not enchantment, not bewitchment. A child choosing the person who made him feel safe." Lady Sirene was the first to kneel. Others followed. Not all, but enough. Enough to matter. Edna stood in the great hall, surrounded by immortal beings who'd lived centuries before she was born, holding a child who'd called her Mama. She didn't bow, didn't apologize for existing, for being human, for taking up space in their world. For the first time in her life, she didn't make herself small. She met their stares and didn't look away. 3 weeks after the court, Edna discovered that being Heartkeeper meant living in the spaces between worlds. Not servant, not nobility, not quite human anymore. Something new, something the castle didn't have words for yet. She spent mornings in the library with Lady Sirene, learning vampire history from leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and secrets. Heartkeepers, she learned, had once been bridges between species, humans whose presence could calm bloodlust, who mediated disputes, who reminded vampires what it meant to value life instead of merely taking it. "We eliminated the position 3 centuries ago," Sirene said, her ancient eyes sad. "When we decided cooperation made us weak. when we forgot that isolation is just another word for dying slowly. Afternoons belonged to the younger vampires who sought Edna out with careful curiosity. They asked questions their elders forbade: what human food tasted like, whether mortals truly feared the dark, how it felt to know your time was finite. Edna answered honestly, and watched understanding bloom where prejudice had festered. But evenings belonged to the three of them. Charles taught Little Star to read, his deep voice patient as he sounded out letters the boy traced with trembling fingers. Edna would sit nearby, mending Charles's cloak or reading her own book, just existing in their orbit. Sometimes Charles would bring her tea without being asked, remembering how she took it. Sometimes she'd hum the lullaby while they worked, and both father and son would go still, listening. Small moments, quiet ones, the kind that built families instead of kingdoms. "Papa," Little Star said one evening, the word still new and wonderful in his mouth. He pointed to a picture in his book, a father holding a child. "Like us." Charles's hand shook as he turned the page. "Yes, like us." Edna watched his profile, saw the grief there, but also something else now. Hope, the terrifying, fragile kind that required you to believe things could be better. She would have loved seeing this, Charles said later, after Little Star had fallen asleep between them on the library sofa. "My wife, she dreamed of him being happy, being whole. He is whole," Edna said quietly. "He always was. The world just needed to catch up." Charles looked at her then, really looked. "I've been king for 2 centuries. I forgot how to be anything else. You reminded me." The words settled between them like a vow. Edna's mother arrived on the 3rd week, brought in a carriage with Charles's own crest. The reunion happened in the entrance hall, where Edna had once scrubbed floors on bleeding knees. Now she stood in silk, watching her mother's tears, feeling the impossible weight of how much had changed. "My girl," her mother whispered, holding Edna's face in work-worn hands. "What has happened to you?" "I saved a child," Edna said simply, "and he saved me back." Little Star appeared then, shy but curious. He looked at Edna's mother with those luminous eyes and said, very carefully, "Grandmother?" Edna's mother knelt, heedless of her aching joints, and opened her arms. Little Star went to her without hesitation, and Edna watched her mother hold the vampire child like he was precious, like he was family. "Yes, sweetheart," her mother said, crying and laughing at once. "Yes, I'm your grandmother." The castle itself seemed to breathe differently now. Servants no longer flinched when Charles passed. Laughter echoed in hallways that had known only whispers. The kitchen staff asked Edna's advice on meals, and she gave it, straddling the line between the life she'd known and the one she was building. Little Star grew stronger. His words came easier, simple sentences, then questions, then stories about his day that tumbled out in breathless rushes. His hands steadied, his steps grew sure. The disability hadn't vanished, but with emotional security came physical strength. Love, it turned out, was better medicine than the court had ever allowed. One evening, restless, Edna walked through the estate gardens. Dead for decades, Charles had said. Nothing grew here anymore, not since his wife died. She moved through skeletal trees and empty flower beds, her new senses picking up the whisper of wind through bare branches. The moon hung full and bright overhead, painting everything silver. Then she saw it, a single white rose, blooming impossibly from a vine that should have been dust. Petals unfurled like a secret, luminous in the moonlight. Perfect, alive. Edna knelt before it, her heart suddenly too large for her chest. She reached out with careful fingers, touched velvet petals that shouldn't exist. The rose was real. Behind her she heard footsteps. Charles appeared at her side, little Star drowsy in his arms. They both stared at the impossible flower. "That's not possible," Charles whispered. "The curse! The gardens have been dead since she died," Edna finished softly. She looked up at him, at the wonder and fear warring in his immortal face. "Maybe they're not dead anymore." Little Star reached toward the rose, making a sound of sleepy delight. His small fingers brushed the petals, and for just a moment the flower seemed to glow brighter. Charles sank to his knees beside Edna, still holding his son. They knelt together in the dead garden that wasn't dead anymore, before a white rose that bloomed like hope. "What's happening?" Charles's voice was raw. Edna took his free hand, squeezed it gently. "I think," she said, "we're healing." The rose swayed in the night breeze, and somewhere in the distance, Edna could have sworn she heard the sound of water. The fountain, perhaps? The one that had run dry the night Charles's wife died. Running again. Edna woke to sunlight. Real sunlight, streaming through windows that should have been curtained against the dawn. She sat up, disoriented, and heard the sound that had pulled her from sleep. Voices outside, dozens of them, speaking in wonder. The gardens had exploded overnight. She threw on her robe and ran barefoot through the halls, following the growing crowd to the courtyard. What she saw stopped her breath. White and crimson roses covered every surface, climbing dead vines that were suddenly alive, bursting from soil that had been barren for 60 years. The ancient fountain at the garden's heart gushed clear water, its basin overflowing with lily pads that shouldn't exist. The entire household had gathered, vampire and human servants alike, staring at the impossible made real. Lady Sirene stood near the fountain with tears streaming down her ageless face. "The curse," someone whispered. "It's breaking." Charles appeared at the courtyard entrance, Little Star's hand clasped in his. The boy pulled free and ran, actually ran, his legs steady and sure, straight toward Edna. She caught him, swinging him up as he laughed with pure joy. "Mama, look, pretty flowers." "I see them, sweetheart." Edna's voice caught. "They're beautiful." Charles walked toward them slowly, his eyes on the gardens, on the fountain, on the life returning to his estate, like blood to frozen limbs. When he reached them, he sank to his knees on grass that had been dead yesterday and was emerald green today. "She wanted this," he whispered. "My wife. She planted these roses when we married, said they'd bloom as long as there was love in these walls." His hands shook. "They died with her. I thought they were gone forever." Little Star touched his father's face with small, gentle fingers. "Don't be sad, Papa." Charles pulled his son close and broke. Great, shuddering sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief, somewhere ancient and untouched. The assembly fell silent, watching their king cry for the first time in living memory. "I'm sorry," Charles gasped against Little Star's hair. "I'm so sorry. I failed her. I failed you. I thought being strong meant feeling nothing, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." Edna knelt beside them, wrapped her arms around them both. The three of them held each other in a garden brought back to life by love, surrounded by witnesses to transformation. Finally, Charles stood. He helped Edna rise, Little Star balanced on his hip, and faced the assembled household. His face was wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. "We were told love makes us weak," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I believed it, believed that distance and duty were strength, that caring too much would destroy us." He looked at his son, at Edna. "But I was wrong. Love is the only thing that's kept us alive, the only thing that matters." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some of the older vampires looked scandalized, but the younger ones, they leaned forward, hungry for permission to hope. "I'm opening this estate to human-vampire cooperation," Charles continued. "We'll establish a school, reform our laws. No more will we call children defective for being different. No more will we treat humans as lesser beings." His eyes found the traditional nobles who'd protested. "You can join us in building something better, or you can leave. But I won't allow this kingdom to die from the same hatred that nearly killed my son." An elderly vampire stormed off, robes billowing. 2 others followed, but dozens stayed. Dozens nodded. Dozens looked at the blooming gardens and understood what was being offered, a chance to choose life over slow extinction. Little Star squirmed until Charles set him down. The boy stood between his parents, reached up to hold both their hands, and said in a clear, perfect voice, "Mama Edna, Papa, I love you both." The words fell like benediction, like proof. A child who'd been non-verbal from trauma, now speaking in complete sentences because he felt safe enough to try. The household erupted in applause. Even some of the traditional vampires looked moved, their ancient faces softening at the sight of genuine familial love. Edna felt tears track down her cheeks. She looked at Charles over Little Star's head and saw him smiling, truly smiling, with his whole face, like joy was something he remembered how to do. Evening came soft and golden. Edna walked through the gardens as sunset painted the sky crimson and amber. She'd never seen the estate in full daylight before. It was breathtaking. Charles found her among the roses, Little Star drowsy in his arms. For a long moment he just stood at the garden's edge, backlit by fading sun. Then he stepped forward, into the light. Edna gasped. The curse had kept vampires confined to shadow and candlelight for generations. But Charles stood in the sunset's glow and didn't burn. Didn't even flinch. He walked to her, hand outstretched, and the light wrapped around him like a blessing. "Stay with us," he said quietly. "Not as heartkeeper, not as my son's caretaker, as family." Edna took his hand. Little Star reached for her, and she gathered him close while Charles's arms came around them both. They stood together in the garden at sunset, vampire king, human woman, child who'd been called defective, and the light didn't hurt anymore. The curse was finally, truly broken. The morning after the gardens bloomed, Charles stood at his bedroom window and watched dawn break over the estate. Real dawn, golden and warm and impossible. He'd forgotten what sunlight felt like, 300 years of darkness, and he'd convinced himself he didn't miss it. He'd been wrong about so many things. He stepped onto the balcony. Sunlight touched his skin like a benediction, warm instead of burning, life instead of death. Below, other vampires emerged cautiously from the manor's shadow, hands outstretched toward light that had been poison for centuries. Lady Sirene laughed, actually laughed, as she twirled in the courtyard with her face turned skyward. "I'd forgotten," she called up to Charles. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it was." The curse that had held them since the great human-vampire war was breaking. Not slowly, not piece by piece. All at once, like a dam giving way. In the village beyond the estate walls, church bells began to ring. Charles heard them clearly. Celebration, not warning. Humans and vampires emerging together to witness the impossible. 300 years of hatred beginning to dissolve in morning light. Edna found him there, Little Star's hand in hers. The boy ran to his father, and Charles swept him up, holding him in sunlight for the first time. "Papa, you're warm." Little Star touched Charles's face with wonder. "Like Mama Edna." Charles pressed his forehead to his son's. "Yes, I am." The moment shattered with the sound of breaking glass. Charles moved before thought, pushing Edna and Little Star behind him as Lady Moravin burst through the garden doors, 2 loyalists flanking her. Blood magic crackled around her hands, forbidden, ancient, deadly. "You think you've won?" Moravin's beautiful face twisted with rage. "You've destroyed everything we built! Everything we—" She didn't finish. The younger vampires who'd been testing the sunlight moved as one, forming a wall between Moravin and the royal family. Not attacking, just standing firm, choosing a side. "It's over, Moravin," Lady Seren said quietly. "Can't you see? The curse is breaking. The old ways are dead. Then I'll kill the human and—" Little Star stepped out from behind his father. The boy's eyes glowed brilliant gold, and suddenly Moravin froze mid-sentence, her face going slack with wonder. Charles felt it too, a wave of pure emotion rolling off his son. Not compulsion, just feeling. The child's gift finally manifesting fully. Moravin sank to her knees, tears streaming. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "So tired of being afraid." Charles approached her slowly. Part of him wanted vengeance, wanted blood for blood. But Edna's hand found his, squeezed gently, and he understood what she was offering. A different choice. "Leave," Charles said. "Take your loyalists. Find somewhere far from here and build whatever life you can. But if you return, if you threaten my family again, I won't offer mercy twice." Moravin looked up at him, disbelief and gratitude warring in her expression. "Why? Because we don't build the new world on more bodies." Charles helped her stand. "We've all lost enough." She fled. Her loyalists followed. And Charles felt the last piece of the old king crack and fall away. Later, in the blooming gardens, Edna's mother asked to speak with them privately. She looked nervous, her work-worn hands twisting in her skirts. "There's something I need to tell you." She glanced at Edna. "About our family, about why you knew the lullaby." Charles went very still. "My grandmother's grandmother was the last heart-keeper." Edna's mother continued. "When the position was eliminated, she fled, married a human man, hid what she was. But she kept the lullaby, passed it down through our line as a simple peasant song, hoping one day—" She looked at Little Star, at Charles, hoping it would matter again. Edna stared at her mother. "You knew? All this time, you knew." "I suspected. When you were small, you could always calm crying babies, soothe angry dogs. My mother said it was the gift, waiting." Her mother's eyes filled. "I never thought you'd find your way back to them." Charles felt the pieces click into place. Why his son had responded to Edna's song, why the barrier recognized her love as genuine, why the ancient magic of heart-keepers had awakened in her presence. She'd been carrying it all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when a vampire king would be desperate enough to see a human servant as salvation. "You were meant for this," Charles said softly. "For us." Edna looked at him, at Little Star playing in the fountain, at the gardens blooming with impossible life. "I don't believe in fate." "Neither do I." Charles took her hands. Little Star ran over, wrapping his arms around both of them. "But I believe in choice, and I choose you, Edna Slack, not because of bloodlines or prophecy or blood magic binding us." He knelt before her in the sunlight that no longer burned. "Marry me. Be my family. Not because you have to, because we want you." Little Star nodded enthusiastically. "Please, Mama, stay forever." Edna looked at them. Vampire king and disabled heir who'd both been broken by loss and were learning how to be whole again. She thought about the servant girl she'd been, scrubbing floors on bleeding knees, thought about the woman she'd become, standing in sunlight with love in her hands. "Yes," she whispered. Yes, I choose you too. Charles stood and kissed her, while Little Star cheered and the gardens bloomed brighter, as if the estate itself was celebrating. The curse was broken, and something better was beginning. The wedding took place in the blooming gardens at sunset, when both species could stand together in light that didn't burn. Human traditions woven with vampire ones, Edna's mother lighting candles, while Lady Serene blessed the union in languages older than kingdoms. Symbolism in every detail, a new era written in ceremony. Lysander, no longer just Little Star, but a boy with a name that meant liberator, carried flowers down the aisle with solemn pride. White roses and crimson, petals scattering at his feet, like promises. His legs were steady now, his smile bright and unafraid. Edna's mother walked her down the garden path, both of them crying. The woman who'd scrubbed floors in this very estate now wore silk and held her daughter's arm as equals gathered to witness love that had shattered every rule. Charles waited beneath an arch of blooming vines, and when Edna reached him, she saw her own wonder reflected in his ancient eyes. Two people who shouldn't have mattered to each other, standing before witnesses who'd tried to keep them apart. His vows came first, spoken in that deep voice that no longer carried only command. You taught me that the strongest magic isn't in blood or power, but in refusing to harden our hearts. You reminded me what it means to be more than a king, to be a father, to be, his voice caught, to be human in all the ways that matter. Edna's turn. She squeezed his hands, feeling the warmth there now, the life. I was taught that my worth came from service, from making myself small so others could be large. You taught me I was wrong, that love doesn't diminish when shared, it multiplies. She looked at Lysander, at Lady Serene, at the assembly of two species learning to hope together. I choose this. I choose us. I choose every day we build together. The ceremony concluded with an offering Edna hadn't expected. Charles knelt before her, a vial of his blood in his hands, ancient magic, complete transformation, immortality. You could live as long as I do, he said quietly. Never age, never die, walk through centuries at my side. The assembly held its breath. Edna looked at the vial, at what it represented. Temptation and trap both. She thought of her mother, growing older each day. Thought of Lysander, who would outlive her by millennia. Thought of all the years she could have. No, she said softly. Shock rippled through the crowd. Charles's eyes widened. I'm honored, Edna continued, cupping his face. But my mortality reminds us both what matters. That we don't have forever, so we must make our time count. That love is precious because it's fragile. She smiled through tears. And I'm enough as I am. Human, temporary, real. Charles stood, pulled her close, and kissed her while the assembly erupted in applause. When they parted, he whispered against her hair, You're right. You're perfect exactly as you are. The celebration lasted into night. The new council was announced, equal representation. Both species, youngest and oldest, working together. Laws drafted, schools planned. The estate officially renamed Thornwood House, in honor of roses that had bloomed from death, beauty that required thorns to protect it, transformation that came through pain. But eventually the guests departed, and only 3 remained. Edna, Charles, and Lysander stood on the master balcony as dawn approached. The boy between them, hands held by both parents, watching the sky lighten from black to grey to gold. Will we always be together? Lysander asked, his voice still touched with uncertainty. Still remembering abandonment, loneliness, fear. Charles and Edna exchanged glances over his head. A whole conversation in a look. acknowledging mortality, uncertainty, the fragility of everything they'd built. "Yes," Edna promised, kneeling to meet Lysander's luminous eyes. "That's what family means. Not that nothing will change or hurt, but that we face it together. That you'll always have us, and we'll always have you. Forever and ever." Lysander pressed. "Forever and ever," Charles confirmed, his hand warm on his son's shoulder. The sun rose over Thornwood House, over gardens that had been dead and were alive again, over a kingdom that had chosen cooperation over extinction, love over purity, hope over fear, over servants who'd become family, and kings who'd learned to kneel. The transformation hadn't been easy, wouldn't continue to be easy. There were still those who resisted, still prejudice to overcome, still centuries of hatred that wouldn't dissolve with one wedding. But standing there in the dawn light, vampire king, human woman, child who bridged both worlds, they understood something the old kingdom hadn't. Change didn't require perfection, it required persistence. Lysander tugged their hands. "Can we have breakfast together, like a real family?" "We are a real family." Edna laughed. "The realest." Charles agreed, and swept his son up while Edna linked her arm through his. They walked inside together as the sun climbed higher, bathing Thornwood House in light that no longer burned. Somewhere in the village, bells rang. Somewhere in the gardens, roses bloomed. Somewhere in the future, historians would mark this as the beginning, the day one servant woman refused to let a child suffer alone, the day love broke a 300-year curse, the day the first heartkeeper in generations chose to stay, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The first day of the new world. And it was only just beginning. If you have listened to this story till the end, please write in the comment section what you think about this story, like, subscribe and share to get notified whenever I post a new story.